Okay, should we restart? Let me introduce our next pair of speakers, Harvey Molotch and Nina Wakefield.
I'm supposed to be up here, right? Yes. And thank you for that gracious introduction.
Very nicely reciprocated.
So I'm going to really, in a way, use this opportunity to think about the work I've done sort of on design, with design, and design, but in relationship to my discipline, which is sociology. And so my thing is more about the way in which design could influence sociology and, by extension, social science, rather than the other way around, although I think there's some implications, and we can take them up. This derives, well, I am really a sociologist and have all sorts of evidence proof. And it's the design part that is less evidence for. And I spend a lot of time with designers in various countries, mostly the US, but not just. And especially brought home to me, hearing this morning's talks, old-fashioned design. That is industrial design, product design. So I'm using the reactionary stuff that you've all been taught to hate as the springboard for my comments, and in effect from what sociology can learn from this reactionary form of design. And and I think there are some things that at least are interesting provocations. So one of the things I learned from my time among the designers was, compared to social science, how tacit the process is through which they go about their work. And I know for those of you who are from within design, maybe it doesn't appear tacit to you, but it does to me, compared to the way in which sociology works, which is almost a kind of conspicuous articulation, leaving no thought unspoken, and if possible, no thought unpublished. Is I think very different. And the only place where sociologists engage in this kind of thinking without that kind of organizing, articulation, systematization, and so forth is occasionally in seminar with undergraduates or in bull sessions, in hotel lobbies outside of the actual, where the business is supposed to be going on. It's sort of like the water cooler as the place where business is actually done. So that's one contrast to make, is between this kind of drive to articulate and systematize versus letting the tacit live as tacit and just presume that it will result in some kind of outcome. Another kind of contrast is how people work together, collaborate, or do not. This will be relevant to me. I want to read just a portion of this for you. This is from someone named, I can't make, oh, there we go. This is somebody named David Anton, who is, you can't read it, and that's okay, because you can at least see the form in which he's writing. And this is an observation about collaboration and how it works. And it's called tuning, as in tuning a musical instrument. And I'm just going to read parts of it, okay, from David Anton. But as it is, we have feet, 2 of them. And one foot goes forward, and that's odd. And when the other one comes to meet it, they are paired, and that's even. And so we're inventing number now. But this is regularly recurrent action. One foot and then the other. We're going somewhere. And we're going somewhere by managing this set of periodically recurrent actions. And someone else is going somewhere in the same way, though probably at another pace. And we have to do something together in this situation. To accomplishing anything together at all, we have to find out what the other person's pace is. We have to find what our pace, and the easiest way for me to do this is for me to try to adjust my pace to his pace or her pace, and for her to adjust her pace to mine. We have to adjust, and it goes on from there. And now how do we do this? By watching my step and her step, I can tell that she's walking slower than I am and at a different angle, and I can slow down, or she could speed up. And she might have speeded up too much while I was slowing down, so that she would have to slow down again while I was speeding up a bit to catch up. And all the time, we would have before us our ongoing acts that we could compare because they were still going on in front of us, and it goes on. And it ends after he brings up the issue of music and singing together. He brings up and ends this way. And I like this idea of tuning because it depends on an idea of going, for there will be no knowing without going, and no common knowing without some kind of going together for a while. Isn't that nice? So that, by the way, I found that in a new book by Howard Becker and Robert Faulkner, which is about music. Howard Becker is an eminent American sociologist who does mostly, or somewhat does ethnography and other things. And he's also a jazz musician, and this is a reflection on making music that this is from in his book. So anyway, that's about a collaboration. That's what I wanted to feature and to bring out. And again, there's a contrast, I think. If we think of a continuum, not such a wide continuum, with design at one end and sociology at the other, maybe anthropology in the middle, this is closer to what my vision of what design is and how designers work together. And it is at least idealized. It is not at all how sociologists work together, not even as idealized. So it is another point of seeing a difference, and to imagine a way in which social science could, I think, be improved, or at least made different, by thinking more along those lines as to how it is that people can coordinate and be in tune with one another as they go about their work. I'm going to go through a list of contrasts, okay, just to alert you, and so you can, as the undergraduates always need to know to take their, save enough room, because I might using bullet points. Another difference is how the research is done. And one of the things that I actually found very attractive about the way these designers work is the fact that they are dealing with situations that are radically in situ. Now, I know that doesn't seem that way from the presentations that I've heard today, but compared to, again, the way sociologists work, who claim to, in fact, have a strongly empirical orientation, it is an empirical orientation which carries with it vast numbers of abstractions, which intervene between the observation and the phenomenon they are observing. And designers operate with a minimum of abstractions, in my view, and have the object as the center of their focus, oftentimes with the human being who they envision as using that object. So there's no, or very little marks, maybe just starting out on their job, just out of school, they'll have a little of that. But that's flushed out of them as they're professionalized. Whereas with sociologists, it doesn't necessarily go in that direction at all. Form and function and how that works. And designers have this like quasi-debate about what matters more, form or function, and but then they all always agree that it's both, and that a successful product represents a success on both fronts. In social science, we have no form, whatever. I'll just make that as a strong statement. That is, design, aesthetics is suspect if it exists at all. We do a sociology of design, a sociology of art, a sociology of aesthetics, and it's just another fucking dependent variable that, depending upon whether you start from a Marxist perspective or some other perspective, you can then explain through these other variables. As opposed to a kind of design sociology, like an aestheticized sociology or a cultural sociology, as opposed to a sociology of culture, which would be treating it as another variable. So designers obviously think in terms of visual phenomenon, and they are very oriented that way. Now this is my favorite example when I'm talking to sociologists about how design works, or at least a favorite. Does anybody know what this is? I've published this image, so maybe my fame has intruded. Anyway, this is used in open heart surgery. And so here it is in use, or schematized as in use. And you turn the knob over there, and that opens the chest cavity. And then the surgeon can get at the stuff inside. Now that began this way, and that's what, when the engineers mocked it up, that's what they had in mind that the thing had to do. And so it went from that, to this. And it's very, I want to point this out, that if this was an object in the 19th century, this would not be intuitively obvious how it worked at all. It would probably be a frightening thing. It's because of the fact that we have really the whole history of art and the history of imageries that we've inherited, that are layered into our minds, that makes it something that a physician would instinctively, I'll say, using very much the wrong word, know how to grasp, know how to handle, and go toward. And I think all products that are successful have that quality. And that's the way aesthetics matter to me. Here you can see, I bring up the history of art because this is really resembles Jean Arc or whatever, and you can actually see those influences. But it doesn't matter about art in that sense. What matters is the fact that the aesthetics is directly involved in the functionality. And I call it a semiotic handle, that the aesthetic it facilitates and is part of. So it's not just, it's both in some additive sense, or agreeing to end an argument, which is the way I see it as designers discuss it. It's more intrinsic than that. And this is my favorite example of the way that works. As opposed to, of course, this is a horrible object in the current moment. For one thing, because it reeks of 19th century industrialism. And you wouldn't want that in your bodies. I like to say 9 out of 10 Hollywood stars want the other one in their body during open heart surgery. So there's form and function and the way it works. Now I think that for social science, it's been very, very important that we don't acknowledge these things, not just when it comes to analyzing products and their use, or the economy, where I think it matters a lot. But the fact that people are driven in this direction, and that this is a part of aesthetics, I'll put it that way, is a part of all aspects of life, including by people who don't acknowledge it. It gives it a proper status in social science, which it simply doesn't have. Anthropology is more acknowledging of it, but sociology is, again, I think, almost rigorously in denial and would take us farther from being of true science, along with the chemists and other Philistines, and put us in line, in league with effeminate men and women of the fine arts disciplines, which we must avoid. So that's another kind of distinction to make. Now, something else that I saw when I studied among designers, and that is that designers understand that some things don't change much, and it's very hard to change them. And they use the word type form a lot. For me, my favorite object is the toilet. The toilets don't change, and in their basic mechanics, they go into pastels or whatever, but they really stick to what they do. And there are a lot of good reasons why, quote, irrational reasons why people fear a change in a toilet. And there are also some mechanical reasons, because they're hooked into a plumbing system and a very hard-ass assemblage that cannot be much mucked with. But anyway, all of that, the designers have a sense of that. And so they don't argue whether or not we live in a time of constant change, or whether the 1950s was the period of great change. That toilets don't change, and you just have to deal with that, compared to, say, women's earrings, which are open to constant change, easy entry, not hard plumbing connected. And there's a lot of, again, good reasons. And so you have a world in which things change a lot and in which things don't change much. And those two phenomena can coexist, which would then end a whole lot of sociological tracks about whether things are always changing or things are staying the same. Also, a lot of songs would not have to have been written if you could have just gotten that through their head. So that's another thing that's we might want to distinguish between the fields of the disciplines. Oh, right, discipline is the word that heads up the session. Discipline and contamination. So, right, of course, what I'm doing is I'm contaminating sociology with disciplines from design, from discipline of design. So, continuing on my merry way, there are differences in how a presentation is made to get the process going. And designers, as I've watched them, have to do a pitch. That's what they do. They pitch. And they use everything at their command. They'll show videos, they'll show prototypes, they'll take people around, they'll do all kinds of things. And sociologists write articles. And if they pitch to foundations for support, but it is and I'll talk about this in a minute, it is all out of the bag at once kind of presentation, of working out what you want to do in advance. And the whole thing is non-iterative. That is, it very much is based on the idea that the creator, in this case the sociologist, knows what they're going to do before they even start. And then they can propose this whole series of steps, including the outcome that will result. And in seeing designers pitch, it is, and also architects. I've done a lot of work with architects over the years. And what you see is that some maybe generic ideas, and then in connection with the client, continuous refinement over time. And of course, lateral interactions with one another across disciplines. As you move toward something like an end product, and it takes a while. Designers also, as they're doing their pitch, engage in all sorts of modes of graphics, of display. We are in social science mired in a great conventionality of speaking in the passive voice, of never using first person, of many other mechanisms that deprive a possibility of seeing the process. And the Anton piece, which you just got a glimpse of, and I told you it didn't matter that you couldn't actually read it because I would read it to you, but you also saw that it was written in a kind of E.E. Cummings style. It wasn't using correct margins or anything like that. And designers are much more likely to leap into alternative modes of pitch and of display and of explaining what they've done and what they're doing than these very rigid modalities through which social science works. And then finally, I'm coming to almost the last one, and that is validity and how you know about validity. If I use conventional sociology, validity is done through statistical tests of confidence intervals, and there's a very large apparatus through which we do it. The way, the test of validity for designers is whether the product succeeds, which means whether the product sells. So in effect, the test of significance is whether or not it succeeded in the market, and hence even exists beyond its early stages of being. The only way I've thought of to make that be true in sociology is if, when you submitted a journal article, you submitted money for an escrow account. And if it turned out to be true, you got the money back. And if it turned out not to be true, you lost the money. Now that's a neoliberal solution to that problem. But otherwise, social science, in my experience, is largely irresponsible and is not evaluated very much on whether or not the assertions are true, but more on whether or not the assertions fit the convention of prior assertions in which they are embedded. I think that's a particularly pessimistic orientation, and I don't believe it completely. But again, it gets the contrast. It gets the contrast going. And now, finally, reform, which many of the speakers earlier today indeed touched on. One of the things that attracted me to design and this very old-fashioned industrial design is they actually solve problems. And coming from sociology, where we're dealing with those issues of poverty and catastrophe and all of that, we really have, I don't think we've ever solved a problem. And if you watch someone design a new garlic press that actually solves the problem of how to get it clean afterward because of the change in the configuration of the screen with the hammer that goes on the piece of garlic, it's an astonishingly miraculous and inspiring and wondrous move. And so that's what designers do, is they reform the world little bit by bit by bit. Now we know, of course, they're working for the pigs, and those pigs are up to no good. And precisely because designers are unideological and face the product, and I raved about it, I was pleased by it, and with this direct connectivity with the situation, they are unbothered by all of this. And I praised them sort of before for not taking Marx with them to the garlic press. And that's good. But at the same time, as these things accumulate, as the critics point out really ad nauseum, we are destroying the world. And designers know that. In one of the meetings of the Industrial Designers Association in America, they had a big thing on the wall and it said, "Industrial design is landfill." So that was like the slogan of the meetings. And this kind of, guilt and feeling but of course they're trapped in this vast apparatus. And so there isn't much room for reform within the discipline as it's practiced. And that is an issue. By the way, in the United States, the designers don't even have a lobbying operation in the way the American Medical Association does or other organizations to actually try to influence the means of production by pointing out, for example, polluting elements and the ways in which things could be done differently. Because designers have nothing to fear from regulation because it just becomes another constraint within which they can exercise their creativity. So within the corporate world, they are really potentially the most liberating force of all. But they don't do it. And that's always been a disappointment to me. They don't make any moves in that direction. And ecology and the ecological crisis now calls the bluff of designers. We know, and sociologists for that matter, we know we can't go on the way we have. And so now I'll just, I'm out of time, but just, I'll invoke ANT, which was spoken of at least earlier in the day, and maybe we'll come back to it because I have become a fan. The idea of reassembling the social appeals to me because of the fact that I think it does correspond. It's, to me, the best of both worlds. It does correspond to a design sensibility in terms of an openness, because it implies that there are many different reassemblies possible. That is, there's an infinite number. If you see the world as a kind of ecology of configurations, then the way things may reassemble is really extraordinarily open question. And many of them will be satisfactory, or at least better than they are now, as opposed to having a sense of a utopia that has to be moved toward, a definitive utopia. It is a much more open architecture, as we might say. It makes many worlds possible, including the possibility, and now this is another contrast with sociology, the possibility of fun. And maybe I'll just add that as a footnote. One of the things that attracted to me about the design world is that in going to the meetings and going to offices, designers, this is very hard for me to say, are really more fun than sociologists.